With the world's eyes on the war in Ukraine, there is more and more interest in the other invasions launched by the Russian army in the modern age. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian army has initiated or taken part in numerous military conflicts, such as in Georgia and Syria. Still, arguably, none of them have caused as much global attention and shock as the First Chechen War. At this point in the war in Ukraine, many analysts are comparing Russia's bungled 2022 invasion with the Russian defeat in Chechnya in the mid-1990s. So in this video, we will describe the background of the First Chechen War and the military operations that led to the Russian withdrawal from Chechnya.
This video was sponsored by our kind YouTube members and patrons. Becoming a YouTube member or patron is the best way to support our work, so we're now providing our supporters with exclusive videos to thank them. Join their ranks to watch the Pacific War series, alongside the First Punic War, Sulla's biography, the Italian War of Unification, Risorgimento, the Russo-Japanese War, Albigensian Crusade, History of Prussia, and much more. 80 or so exclusive videos in total. In 2024, YouTube members and patrons will watch series on the Fall of Sparta, the Reconquista, Second Punic War, Spanish War of Succession, and Russian Civil War, and will continue getting early access to all videos, access to an exclusive Discord server, will know our schedule, and vote on future videos. YouTube member and patron support allows us to keep the majority of our videos free in a world where YouTube monetization income is very uneven. If you want to support our work, join their ranks today via the link in the description and pinned comment. Thank you. The Chechen people have long inhabited the mountainous territory of the North Caucasus. Initially a pagan people, they gradually started to Islamize in the late medieval period. Being fiercely independent and possessing natural defenses of the Greater Caucasus Mountains did not save them from the southward expansion of the Russian Empire. The Russian incursions into the Caucasus in the late 18th century were met with defiant resistance from the Chechen people until the late 1860s, when Russia finally seized control of the region. After the toppling of the Tsars, Chechnya's short-lived attempt at independence was thwarted by Bolshevik Russia in 1921, as the new rulers of Russia incorporated the Chechen homeland into the Soviet Union as the Checheno-Ingush Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. The defining moment of Soviet rule in Chechnya was the deportation of the Chechen people to Central Asia in 1944, which led to the death of hundreds of thousands of Chechens. Chechnya was one of the poorest regions of the Soviet Union, and the native Chechens were institutionally disadvantaged. Until 1989, only ethnic Russians had been appointed to the position of first secretaries of the Communist Party of the Autonomous Republic. So the Chechen people had every right to be unhappy with Soviet rule. In 1990, the All-National Congress of Chechen People elected the pro-independence nationalist Dzhokhar Dudayev as their leader, the first Chechen who rose to the rank of general in the Soviet Air Force. Soon after, the sovereign Chechen Republic of Noshchicho was proclaimed. Chechnya became a de facto independent republic, unilaterally seceded from Russia, and Dudayev was elected president in 1991. While the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, encouraged the peoples of the Soviet Union to grab as much freedom as you can, the Russian Federation did not intend to let Chechnya go. On the 7th of November 1991, Yeltsin signed a decree proclaiming a state of emergency in Chechnya. He sent 1,000 Russian troops to Grozny, but as soon as this unit landed at the Grozny airport, it was surrounded by armed supporters of Dudayev and had to go back without fulfilling any of its missions. Additionally, the Chechen people responded by taking control of MIA and KGB buildings, military bases, and key transportation infrastructure. Just 4 days later, the state of emergency was abolished, and the Russian military and the police started to leave Chechnya, which enabled Chechen authorities to take control of the Soviet military assets in the region, allowing them to create a functioning army. It was a humiliating defeat for Yeltsin and Russia. Russia was concerned that allowing one of its subjects to secede could cause a domino effect, resulting in other ethnic minorities within the Federation demanding their freedom. In fact, at the time, Russia was struggling to keep other republics within the Federation. For instance, it took 2 years of negotiations to convince the oil-rich Tatarstan to remain in the Russian Federation, and the treaty between Moscow and Tatarstan was signed in 1994. Russia would not sign a similar treaty with Chechnya, as the Chechens continued insisting on sovereignty, while the Russians did not trust Dudayev and wanted him out. It was increasingly looking like a situation which could only be solved by violence.
It is necessary to note that the socio-economic situation in Chechnya during this time was quite bad. Being left outside of its usual trade and economic connections within the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation, an already poor Chechnya was struggling hard. The main source of income in the country, oil extraction, was decreasing due to the need for more skilled workers. A bad economy, high unemployment, and lack of stability due to the existence of many armed groups gradually made Dudiev less popular among Chechens, leading to a powerful opposition against his rule. In March 1992, Chechen opposition activists seized Grozny's television and radio stations, demanding Dudiev's resignation. Dudiev's National Guard crushed this attempt on his power. In late 1992, Ingushetia seceded from the former Chechen Ingushetian ASSR and joined the Russian Federation as the Republic of Ingushetia. In the spring of 1993, Dudiev declared the dismissal of the parliament, the constitutional court, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. On June 4th, he sent his supporter Shamil Basayev to occupy the building of the Grozny City Soviet, which hosted the meetings of the parliament and the constitutional court. Russia viewed the political crisis in Chechnya as another opportunity to depose Dudiev without being directly engaged, using the main opposition group against Dudiev's rule, which received financial and military support from Russia. The Provisional Council controlled some of the territories north of the river Terek, where the population was arguably more loyal to Russia. A civil war in Chechnya raged throughout 1994, and its climax came in November 1994 when the Provisional Council made another attempt to take Grozny. Their column consisted of 1,500 to 3,000 soldiers and 42 T-72 tanks, supported by several helicopters and Su-27 jets. On November 26th, Dudiev loyalists defeated the enemy, destroying 20 tanks with RPGs, killing 150 attackers, and capturing several vehicles and opposition troops in the process. Russia had backed the wrong horse, and even worse for the Kremlin was that some of the captured men were Russian soldiers, proving that Russia was indeed supporting the Provisional Council. This revelation prompted the Kremlin to double down with an ultimatum to Chechnya, which demanded the surrender of all armed groups in Chechnya. The proof of Russian meddling in the civil war in Chechnya and the ensuing ultimatum, which the Dudiev government rejected, caused many people disillusioned with Dudiev to unite around him again. In December, Russia started the bombardment of Chechnya. One of the main targets of the Russian bombing campaign was the Chechen Air Force, which had 266 military aircraft left by the Russian army in 1992. Although the Chechen army lacked pilots to fly all of these planes, the fact that Russia managed to destroy all of these planes by attacking Kankala and Kalinovsky airfields on December 1st was a significant victory for Russia, as it ensured their air superiority throughout the First Chechen War. Russia gathered their aircraft at the airfields of the North Caucasus Military District, which included 140 Su-24, 25 and 27 fighters, 55 helicopters of the Mi-24, Mi-8 and Mi-6 make, and a large number of An-12, 22 and 124 and Il-76 transport aircraft. Russia initially deployed 23,000 soldiers, commanded by the Defense Minister, General Pavel Grachev, the Joint Group of the Federal Forces, Commander General Gennady Troshev, and the Commander of the Interior Troops, Commander General Anatoly Kulikov. The Chechen army was commanded by President Dudiev himself and Colonel Aslan Maskhadov, along with paramilitary units of militia commanders like Shamil Basayev and Ibn al-Khattab. Before further describing the military strategy and tactics of the Russian army in the First Chechen War, it is necessary to note that not everyone in the Russian political and military elite was in favor of a military solution to the Chechen crisis. The chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee, Sergei Yushchenkov, actively opposed the invasion of the Russian army after the Provisional Council's failed attempt at a coup d'etat in November 1994. The Deputy Defense Minister, General Boris Gromov, resigned from his post due to his public opposition to the invasion of Chechnya. Over 550 officers of the Russian military are believed to have been sacked and punished for their opposition to the war. Two main arguments against this war were that, first, the Russian army was completely unprepared. Second, it would not be a walk in the park, as many believed. And third, you do not send an army against your own people. Yeltsin and his advisors ignored these arguments, and the Russian ground forces entered Chechnya on the 11th of December 1994. The Russian invasion force was called the United Group of Federal Forces, UGFF, and consisted of 3 groups. The Northern Group, commanded by the Deputy Commander of the Northern Caucasus Military District, Lieutenant General Vladimir Chelindin, consisted of 15 battalions, 2 companies of internal troops, 41 tanks, 132 BMPs, and 99 armoured personnel carriers. It moved into Chechnya from Mozdok. The Western Group, commanded by the Deputy Commander of the Airborne Troops, the VDV, Lieutenant General Alexander Chindarov, moved from Vladikavkaz and Belsan through Ingushetia and consisted of 11 battalions, 34 tanks, 98 BMPs, and 67 armoured personnel carriers. The Eastern Group, commanded by the commander of the 8th Army Corps, Lieutenant General Lev Rokhlin, advanced from Dagestan, consisting of 8 battalions, 7 tanks, and 162 armoured personnel carriers. The commander of the Northern Caucasus Military District, Colonel General Alexei Mityukin, was appointed the commander of the UGFF. 2 brigades of internal troops were tasked with defending the perimeter of the administrative border of Chechnya. Overall, the Russian invasion force consisted of 23,800 service members. The groups advanced in columns, with the airborne troops in the front, followed by other regular army units, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs (MDV) troops coming last. They were supported by Mi-24 helicopters and Su-25 planes. The Russian grand strategy consisted of several phases. First, these 3 groups were supposed to advance and surround Grozny in 3 days. The second phase consisted of taking Grozny under control by securing the presidential palace, other governmental buildings, radio and television stations, along with other strategic objects. The plan was to complete the second phase in 4 days. The third phase aimed to push the Chechen forces further south into the mountains and establish a pro-Russian government in the occupied areas in 5 to 10 days. The fourth and final phase was about defeating the rest of the resistance in more difficult mountainous areas of the south, which could have taken longer. Conversely, the Chechen strategy was to avoid meeting the Russian troops in frontal battles in the open field, and instead use ambush tactics against the Russian rear. The idea was to slow down the Russian advance on Grozny and gain enough time to prepare for the defense of their capital. The Russian advance on Grozny was not as smooth as hoped. The Eastern Group was delayed in the Khasavyurt district of Dagestan by the local Chechen population, which managed to block their advance for a while. The Western Group was attacked in the village of Basuki. The Northern Group was the fastest, reaching the village of Dolinsky, 10 kilometers away from the outskirts of Grozny, where they were shelled by the Chechen resistance, but were able to blockade Grozny from the northwest. The Eastern Group reached Tolstoyurt on December 15th. The Western Group bypassed the Sunzhensky Ridge and blocked Grozny from the west. Finally, the Eastern Group blockaded Grozny from the east. The 104th Guards Airborne Division captured the Kankala military airfield and defeated the Chechen counterattack on December 28th, blockading Grozny from the Argon Gorge. Grozny was not blockaded from the south, likely by design, for the Russian command intended to let the Chechen militia leave Grozny from there, making it easier for the Russian troops to occupy the city. It is necessary to note that the Russian advance up to the First Battle of Grozny was relatively smooth and uneventful due to easier terrain and the relatively more loyal attitude of the local population to Russians north of the river Terek. But the appearance of the Russian forces caused a surge of popular support for Dudiev, and more people joined the armed resistance against the Russian occupation from all areas of Chechnya. Even before the Battle of Grozny, the Russian command made several changes to its hierarchy. Mityukin was dismissed as the commander of the UGFF due to delays in the completion of the first phase. The deputy chief of the operational administration of the Chief of Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, General Anatoly Kvashnin, became the commander of the UGFF. Additionally, the 3 Russian army columns were modified into 4. Going forward, there would be a northern group commanded by General Konstantin Pulikovsky, a western group commanded by General Ivan Babichev, a northeastern group commanded by Lieutenant General Lev Rokhlin, and an eastern group commanded by Major General Nikolai Straskov. It is evident that the Russian government was not happy with the execution of the first phase of its invasion, and made changes before the battle to seize the Chechen capital began in earnest. Instead of withdrawing from the south of Grozny, as the Russian plan envisaged they would, the Chechens brought reinforcements into the city, intending to make a stand there. The Chechen defense of Grozny was commanded by the Chief of Staff, Colonel Aslan Maskhadov. Many militia groups of the Chechen field commanders, like Shamil Basayev's Abkhaz battalion, were well prepared for Grozny's defense. The defense of the capital was organized district by district, each having several groups defending it. Groups usually consisted of 8 to 10 men, each having 1 or 2 anti-tank weapons, 1 light machine gun, and 1 or 2 sniper rifles, while the rest were armed with AK-47s. Groups operated largely independently on the ground, but followed the general instruction of the Chechen command during Grozny's defense. The Chechen militia knew the city quite well and could move around quickly to take the Russian invaders by surprise. Despite the Russian military command's requests to wait an additional 2 weeks before attacking Grozny, Yeltsin was convinced the attack should happen immediately. The Russian invasion force was bolstered with units of the Leningrad, Volga and Ural military districts, and as a result the overall force reached 38,000 men and 230 tanks. The Russian plan was to attack with all 4 columns, which would come together near the presidential palace, while 2 airborne units were deployed at the southern entrance of Grozny to harass Chechen defenders, who were supposed to withdraw from Grozny according to the Russian plan. On the 31st of December 1994, the First Battle of Grozny commenced. 250 units with armoured vehicles were sent into the city. The Russian army suffered from poor coordination and communication among units and different branches of the military, and poor morale of the troops, as many soldiers were forced conscripts. It also lacked many mundane yet crucial things, like up-to-date maps of Grozny, relying instead on outdated Soviet maps. The Chechens exploited this by switching street names and signs to confuse the Russians. The Russian armoured vehicles moved inside Grozny with little cover, and were easy targets for the Chechen defenders waiting for them in high-rise buildings. A quote from Ilyas Akhmedov, future foreign minister of Chechnya, describes the situation in Grozny quite well. What struck me at first was that Russian tanks and APCs, armoured personnel carriers, were not even advancing in battle order. They were marching as if on parade ground, with only a distance of 5 to 6 meters between each APC. They were unable to maneuver or turn around when necessary. What is more, infantry was also advancing in complete disorder among the APCs. Our tactics were simple but effective. We let the Russian columns enter the city, driving along streets where the APCs and tanks could not maneuver. When a column was engaged in a narrow avenue, we simply shot the leading APC and the last one of the column. The Russians were sitting ducks. The advance of the Western Group was stopped in its tracks, while in the east, the 129th Motor Rifle Regiment was defeated and retreated, not engaging the enemy again until January 2nd. General Rocklin's 8th Corps made some progress from the northeast. The most dramatic events unfolded in the north of Grozny. The 131st Maikop Separate Motor Rifle Brigade and the 81st Samara Guards Motor Rifle Regiment of the Northern Group advanced to the train station and the presidential palace, where the Chechen militia ambushed them. Russian losses were devastating. The Maikop Brigade suffered 85 KIA and 72 MIA, losing 20 out of 26 tanks and 102 out of 120 APCs. More than 100 soldiers were captured. The attempts of General Rocklin's 8th Corps to break through to save the entrapped units were unsuccessful, since other Chechen groups prevented their advance. Despite this, they remained the only effective Russian force in Grozny, and withstood the Chechen counterattacks on their positions in the north of the city in the early days of January. On January 3rd, they sent suspected civilians to the so-called filtration center in Mozdok, where the authorities were supposed to find out whether these civilians were members of the Chechen militia. The failure of the Russian army's New Year's Eve attack on Grozny forced them to change their tactics. On January 4th and 5th, Russia started bombarding Grozny block by block with artillery and airstrikes, making Chechen hit-and-run tactics less effective. Instead of parading through narrow streets with massive armoured columns, the Russians were now sending smaller teams to eliminate Chechen resistance groups in destroyed districts. On the 7th of January 1995, the northeastern and northern groups were united under the command of General Roklin, the only relatively successful organizer of the initial Russian military effort in Chechnya. Along with that, reinforcements, including Marines from the Pacific, Northern and Baltic fleets, were deployed into Chechnya. However, the Chechens had reinforcements of their own. Since the Russians did not control the south of Grozny, additional Chechen militia groups were able to join their capital's defense. After changing their tactics, the Russians managed to turn the tide gradually. On January 7th, the Russian 45th Airborne VDV Regiment captured the Oil Chemistry Institute, one of the tallest buildings in Grozny. On the same day, during the installment of checkpoints in captured areas of Grozny, the first Russian general, Major General Vorobyev, was killed. On January 12th, a Russian airborne unit captured the building of the Chechen Ministry of Internal Affairs, but the attempt of another group to take Grozny University was repelled. Despite some gains in the city, the Chechen resistance was still strong, thanks to its mobile movement through the city, including the underway passages, which the Russians were unaware of. On January 13th, elements of the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade and the 98th Airborne Division started their attack on the Cabinet of Ministers buildings. After fierce resistance, the last Chechen defenders withdrew from the building on January 19th. On the same day, the Russians took the presidential palace after a massive bombardment which caused the building to practically collapse. Following this, Chechen resistance groups retreated to the east of the Sunja River and south of the city, with the Minutka Square becoming the new line of defense. On January 21st, the 33rd Separate Motor Rifle Regiment of the Rokhlin Group and the 21st Airborne Brigade of the Babachev Group established a bridgehead over the river. On January 30th, it took several positions in and around Minutka Square, but was eventually repelled by the Chechen army. The Russian government was not happy with how the Battle of Grozny was proceeding, since their army was taking massive losses, the pace of their advance was slow, and Grozny was practically razed to the ground. Thus, more administrative changes were made. Yet another commander of the UGFF was appointed, Colonel General Anatoly Kulikov. In addition, more reinforcements were deployed to Chechnya, which raised the number of troops dedicated to this campaign to 70,000. Moreover, in February, a Southern Army group was created. These changes had immediate positive effects for the Russians. The Southern Army group was able to stall the Chechen counteroffensive on February 5th, preventing the Chechens from replenishing their forces with fresh reserves. The Russian units of different army groups managed to ford the river Sunja. Gradually, the Russian army was advancing towards the southern outskirts of Grozny. The Chechen militia groups had to withdraw from the city, many of them engaging in heavy battles with the advancing Russian forces all the while. For instance, Basayev's battalion came under heavy fire from the northern group and took casualties while retreating. By February 9th, the Russian army had almost reached the Rostov-Baku highway on the southern outskirts of Grozny. Attempts by both sides to achieve a ceasefire failed, and on February 21st, the Russian army captured the television center of Grozny. The last district of Grozny to fall was Chernorechnya on March 6th, marking the capture of the Chechen capital by the Russians complete. Following this, the Russians established a pro-Russian administration in Grozny. After the successful capture of Grozny, Russia continued its advance. On March 23rd, Russia occupied Argon. Shally fell on March 30th, followed by Gudemes on March 31st. The occupation of Shally is of particular importance because Dudiev had established his headquarters there following the fall of Grozny. Russia also started its operations in the village of Bamut in March, where the 136th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, the 324th Motor Rifle Regiment, and the 94th Airborne Group engaged Ruslan Kaikoriyev's, Hamzat Batayev's, and Kazimir Kachikayev's militia groups. While the battle in Bamut was raging on, the most notorious massacre of the First Chechen War was committed. On April 7th to 8th, the internal troops of the MIA, consisting of the Sovrinskaya Brigade, the Special Rapid Response Unit (SOBR), and OMON, moved into the village of Shemashki of the Achkoy-Matan district, which was defended by the Abkhaz Battalion of Basayev. The Russian units took this village by massacring more than 100 civilians, according to the UNHCR, and the Russian human rights group Memorial. Russia was already taking huge losses during this war, but destroyed cities and villages and massacred civilians made an already unpopular war in Chechnya even more unwelcome. By now, the Chechen forces had been gradually turning into a guerrilla army, since it was impossible to conventionally confront the Russian army, which enjoyed a massive advantage in manpower and firepower, along with having absolute dominance in the air. Chechen guerrilla warfare had caused many casualties for the Russian army, but by April 1995, the Russians had still managed to take almost all of the flat land of Chechnya. The Chechens were trying to hold a line of towns and villages on the edges of the mountains, from Bamut in the west, Chiriyurt in the middle, and Sergenyurt in the east. Taking these towns under their control would allow the Russians to enter the mountainous part of Chechnya, where the Chechen leadership organized its stubborn resistance. Capturing Chiriyurt would open the way for Dubiyurt and the Wolf's Gate, allowing the Russians to launch operations in Maskhadov's headquarters in Vedeno and Dudiyev's base at Shatoy. Capturing Chechen would give the Russians an entrance to the strategically important Vendo district, which had a road to Vedeno. While Yeltsin signed a decree suspending Russian operations in Chechnya from April 28th to May 12th in connection with the 50th anniversary of the Soviet victory in World War II, engagements on the battlefield continued. Chiriyurt was captured after weeks of bombardment. For 2 months, Isa Muniev's and Vaha Aigemov's groups defended the village against elements of the 108th Airborne Regiment, the 324th Motor Rifle Regiment, and the 166th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. On May 20th, the village's main bastion of the Chechen defense, the cement plant, fell to the Russians, and the Chechen militia groups withdrew. Bamut was taken on May 24th, after, according to the Russian command, the Russian army lost more than 800 service members in battle for it. This was followed by the capture of Vedeno on June 3rd and Shatoy and Novhayurt on June 12th, but this was not accompanied by the destruction of the Chechen resistance potential, as most of the time the Chechen militia groups managed to withdraw from captured areas while staying intact. Although many Chechen rebels were living on to fight another day, they were still losing on the battlefield. As a result, some of the Chechen militia groups and field commanders, particularly Basiev, started to employ terrorist tactics. In June 1995, Basiev's group seized a hospital in a Russian town named Budyanovsk, taking more than 1,000 hostages. His demand was the Russian withdrawal from Chechnya. Several attempts by the Russian special forces to free hostages by force failed, and Basiev's group left Budyanovsk only after the Russians agreed to the safe passage of his group to Chechnya. This was another humiliating defeat for the Russian army in the First Chechen War, but it was also the first terrorist operation conducted by a Chechen field commander, undoubtedly harming the international reputation of the Chechen resistance. Several other terrorist acts, like the hijacking of a plane in Turkey and the capture of hostages in Kyzylyar, Dagestan, were conducted in 1996. Until the end of 1995, the Chechen army conducted several operations, demonstrating that they were still a capable force. On August 21st, the group of Alodi Hamzatov took the second biggest city of Chechnya, Argun, and left it only after heavy shelling by the Russian army. On October 6th, there was an attempt on the life of the commander of the UGFF, General Romanov, who ended up in a coma. The Russian command responded with airstrikes on several Chechen villages. On December 10th to 12th, the groups of Salman Radiev, Kunkar Pasha Israpilov, and Sultan Gelishkanov retook Gudumis, but the internal troops and OMON managed to drive the Chechen groups out of the town after heavy fighting on December 23rd. On the 6th of March 1996, the Chechen militia shocked the Russian army by arriving in Grozny with 1,500 to 2,000 men and attacking the Russian units there. Their intention was not to liberate Grozny, even though at the high point of this attack they took a considerable portion of the capital under their control. Their goal was to show Russia, the world, and the Chechen people that the resistance was still going strong, and that it was capable of major operations. On the second day of the attack, Russia completed assembling airborne troops, tanks, and artillery to retake lost positions, but the Chechen fighters simply withdrew with captured weapons. According to the official figures, the Russian army lost 70 servicemen in this attack. On April 16th, the group led by the Saudi jihadist Ibn al-Khattab carried out a deadly ambush on a Russian convoy in Shatoy, which caused the resignation of Russian Defense Minister Grachev. But 5 days later, a precision missile strike by Su-24 and Su-25 jets killed the Chechen President Dudiev. However, rather than making the resistance movement crumble, Dudiev's death provided a martyr figure for the Chechen resistance to rally around. On the 6th of March 1996, just 3 days before the inauguration of Yeltsin for his second term as president, a 1,500-strong group of Chechen fighters, commanded by Shamil Basiev, attacked Grozny once again. Part of the group took up positions on the roads approaching Grozny to guard against Russian counterattacks, while most of the fighters moved toward the city center. The Russians had about 12,000 troops in and around Grozny, but they were surprised. Within hours, the Chechen fighters took control of swathes of Grozny and besieged the Russian garrison. On the 5th day of the attack, the 276th Motor Rifle Regiment was sent to Grozny to repel the Chechen fighters, but was defeated in battle. Simultaneous to the retaking of Grozny, other Chechen groups attacked Gudemez and Argon, repulsing almost all Russian troops from those areas. To repel the Chechen attack on Grozny, the Russian army reacted by shelling and firing both on the city and Chechen positions, with tanks, helicopters and artillery. After several days, the Russians agreed to a ceasefire under pressure from the public. On the 31st of August 1996, the Kestiverta Accord was signed between the new leader of Chechnya, Aslan Maskhadov, and the Russian Security Council chairman, General Alexander Lebed. According to the agreement, Russian forces would leave Chechnya, Grozny would be demilitarized, and the resolution of the Chechen question would be postponed to 2001. In May 1997, a treaty confirming this agreement was signed between Yeltsin and Maskhadov in Moscow. Against all the odds, the Russian army had been defeated by the Chechen resistance movement after taking huge losses. It is difficult to state the exact number of casualties on both sides. According to the UGFF staff, 4,103 Russian soldiers were killed in action, while the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers claims a figure of at least 14,000 killed. According to the Russian government, 17,391 Chechen fighters were killed during the First Chechen War, while Maskhadov claimed that almost 3,000 Chechen fighters were killed. Meanwhile, various memorials claim up to 50,000 civilian deaths. Yeltsin's and the Russian government's hope for a short and victorious war to defeat the Chechen attempt at sovereignty and to improve their shaky internal political positions failed utterly. Even at the very beginning, the Chechen War was unpopular among the Russian public and part of its elite, and this sentiment gradually grew throughout the war.